In this video, I'm going to be showing you how I made these two live edge cherry end tables, and I had a pretty big design failure. So I'll tell you more about that. Keep watching, hope you enjoy the video. Let's get right into it. The track saw was the easiest way that I could figure out how to break these down into their final size. Plus, there was not really a straight edge on any of them, so I needed to establish that on two of the sides for the look that I was going for. I grabbed my track saw and set it to a full depth plunge, which was fine for some of the cuts, but then one of these slabs had a lot of tension in it, and you'll see it really started to bog and bind. When this starts to happen, it's probably a good idea to just stop and set your depth of cut a lot less and make it in two different passes. I was able to get through it by going a little bit slow, but you can see there was a lot of burning. To get rid of that burn, I just moved the track over about 1/8 of an inch and took one more light pass. Try to keep the saw moving. I didn't quite keep it moving the whole time, so I got a little bit of burning, but that was easily sandable. I was removing some of the size of this slab just because it was too big to be an end table, but also because on a couple of the ends there were some really large cracks and stuff. I was going to leave some of those because I'm going to add some bow ties in them, but I didn't want quite that much cracking. I took them over to my CNC and put a flattening bit in it and just used the joystick to go back and forth quite a few times until I got one flat side. Then I could flip it over and flatten the other side using that side as a reference. I did this on both of the slabs and it came out really great. These slabs have a lot of curl and quilting in them, so I got a little bit of tear out from the flattening process. I started with a really aggressive grit on my sander and just went to town for a little while. There was a lot of sanding on this piece just to make it the way I wanted, but that's just part of it sometimes. I don't know where the footage went of me removing the bark, but I used a draw knife to do that, and then I was able to sand the edges. As I mentioned before, there were some cracks in these pieces, and I wanted to just keep those cracks from opening up any farther and use this as an opportunity to kind of decorate them by using some bow ties. I have a Bowtie Jig that I actually sell on my website, so I've got links to that below, and that's what you see me using here. The basic premise is I use an inlay kit on my router. It has a brass bushing and it comes with a specific bit that offsets the width of that bushing. So you route out the mortise, which is the hole with that bushing on it. Then without removing the bit or anything, you pull that bushing off of there and then you route out your actual bow tie, the piece, the tenon that will go down in the hole. And it's a perfect fit. I've done a full video on this process on my channel. It was a couple of years ago, so I'll put links to that below if you want to go see in depth how I do these inlays. What you saw me doing a minute ago was just cleaning out the crack with a razor knife and some small picks, getting any of the little splinters or torn out pieces from down inside that crack. It really gives a much cleaner look once you get your inlay done. I had a scrap piece of sycamore that had these really cool ray flecks in it, and I wanted to use those for my bow ties. So I set up my jig again to cut out the bow ties and cut 3 of them out of this material. I countersunk some holes on this template on either side of the bow tie, and that way I can just secure it down to the piece that I'm cutting the tenon out of with a couple of screws. And then off camera, I removed the tenons from the workpiece using the bandsaw. Okay, moving on to the legs. I wanted to have a really nice contrast between the cherry and whatever I was going to use for the legs. So I found some white oak pieces and thought, let me try my hand at some India ink. I wanted the wood grain to show through, but I wanted it to be jet black. Once I figured out the height I needed these legs to be, I just set up a stop block at the miter saw and chopped all of them. For inlays to go in smoothly, you really need to remove just a little bit off of the bottom side. That way it can kind of seat itself down into the mortise. I just used a chisel for this. And then of course, because the bit in the router is round, you have to round the corners just a little bit. A few swipes with sandpaper takes care of it. Then I just add some glue and use a scrap piece of wood to drive it home. This is important because it applies pressure across the entire piece so you won't split your bow tie, and it also lets you know when you've reached the surface of your material because it bottoms out. A quick note about these bow ties for those who might not know. The grain is actually running the length of the bow tie, so it's the opposite of the grain in the actual workpiece. This acts as a mechanical fastener and the shape of the thing to actually hold that crack from opening up anymore. This one was actually not perfect on the end. There is still human error that is in this equation, so I just added a little bit of wood glue down in that crack and sanded it immediately to let that sanding dust get in there, and it turned out great. And see what I mean about how cool that sycamore material is? It's just very unique. More sanding, getting all of the legs prepped and ready to assemble. I'm using floating tenons for these connections, and you'll see in a minute why it's kind of complicated. The layout is very important, as with most things, because once you start cutting those mortises, you really can't go back. You'll see as the legs start to come together a little bit of what my design idea is. I want basically an L shape underneath this table that extends out enough that it will support the table. I wanted it to kind of have a floating look, and I thought that contrast would be very minimal and go with the live edge of the slabs. The floating tenons will provide some strength for these joints as well as keep them aligned, but I'm going around with a square after I get the clamps on just to make sure that everything was square. After I had those two first frames done, now you can start to see that L-shaped design that I'm going for. It was a little bit of a tricky glue up, but it ended up coming together quite nicely. I sanded as much as I could with my random orbit sander, but then there was a lot of hand sanding to do. There were so many corners on this piece, I couldn't really get in there with the random orbit sander, so hand sanding it was. The India ink I'm using is a water-based dye, and it will raise the grain of the wood a little bit. So because of that, I raised the grain with some water first, sanded it back one more time, again, more sanding, and then it was finally time to apply the India ink. A quick note about this stuff, it is dye, and it gets absolutely everywhere. It's very thin and runny, and so it has the tendency to kind of splash when you're pouring it onto a rag or applying it. So just cover your workbench or whatever surface you're using and use gloves and just take precautions because it is messy. And you can see right here after I apply this and wipe off the excess exactly why I wanted to use this with white oak. You can see that grain through the black and it just looks really cool. It only took one coat of this stuff, but then after it dried I came back with a rag and just wiped off any excess. I did not want black imprinting on anything else. One of the last steps with the bow ties and the cracks was just to hand sand a little bit right on the edges. This just softened it so there were no sharp spots. I used my branding iron on the bottom of both pieces and then applied a hard wax oil as the finish. I was a little worried that the black would kind of come off as I was applying this same finish to the base, but I didn't want a lacquer or something with a different sheen. I wanted this very matte black look, so I decided to go with the same finish as the top. The bases were pretty simple to attach to the tops. I just used some blue tape to mark where they needed to be so that I could make sure to put them back in that position. Then I pre-drilled 2 holes in each of the bars of the base and then used a larger Forstner bit to counterbore a spot for a washer to go. That would allow the washer to sit down in there, and these holes that I'm drilling all the way through are larger than the screws I'm using to account for wood movement. It's time for some real talk. Are you ready? Okay. I really like this design that I came up with. It has a real clean look with kind of this floating edge, and it had potential to really be nice. I did not do enough prototyping, so it's just a design failure on my part, because by the time I assembled everything and put finish on it, you know, with a few tests and put these as far forward as they could be, the gravity just wants to kind of make it lean. So with some more prototyping, I think this design could work by making these 2 sides a little shorter and shifting the entire base more toward the center. It would still have a floating look, but then the weight would be distributed a little bit better. I was too far along in this build to really go back and start over. I'd already applied finish to everything, so I'm not doing that. I'm calling an audible. I found these metal legs that actually I think will lend to the design. It will still be very minimalist, which is what I want, and they actually have adjustable feet on the bottom here. So the idea is that this is going to sit pretty close to the edge. Obviously I've got to raise it up some more to secure it, but I think that's going to be a nice solution for these tables, to not have to start all the way over. If you're considering a design like this, do some more prototyping. Do yourself a favor, because I didn't do myself any favors with not testing it quite enough. Learn from me. After I got both of those legs attached, it was time to take the tables inside and see how they looked in the living room. Here come some of the final shots. Thank you so much for watching. I really hope you enjoyed this video. Please tell me what you would have done in this instance when I called an audible and added this metal leg. I like the way it ended up looking, but leave me a comment and let me know what you would have done differently. Thanks so much, and I'll see you on the next video.